There's a question most people avoid asking themselves, especially as retirement gets closer, not because they don't know the answer, but because they already do. And it's uncomfortable. If you're in your late 30s, 40s, or early 50s, you've probably had this thought at least once. Am I actually ready to stop working one day? Not in theory, not based on a calculator you used years ago, but in real life. Because when you strip everything down, retirement is a simple equation. Money coming in versus money going out. And for most people, that equation isn't as stable as it seems. Let's look at a very normal situation. Someone living in the United States or Europe earning around $70,000 to $90,000 to $90,000 a year. On paper, that sounds comfortable, but after taxes, they're taking home roughly $4,500 a month. Then life starts taking its share, rent or mortgage, around $1,500 to $2,000, car payment, $400 to $600, insurance, utilities, groceries, another $1,000 or more, and then the quiet expenses. Subscriptions, occasional dining out, replacing things, social expectations. Before they notice, they're left with maybe $500 to $800, sometimes less. And this is where something subtle happens. They tell themselves, I'm doing okay, because technically they are. Bills are paid. Nothing feels urgent. Life feels manageable. But manageable is not the same as prepared. Now consider this. Out of that remaining amount, how much is actually saved? Not planned to be saved, but truly saved. Maybe $200 or $300 a month. Some months, nothing. Over time, that becomes $3,000 to $4,000 a year. Over 20 years, maybe $80,000, or with growth, around $120,000. Now pause, because this is where the illusion begins to break. What does $120,000 really mean in retirement? Spread over 20 years, it becomes about $500 per month. That's not a retirement income. That's support, not sustainability. And this is the gap most people never fully confront. Not because they're irresponsible, but because the system allows them to feel stable, without being secure. As long as income continues, everything seems under control. But retirement removes that income completely, and suddenly, the same life that felt fine becomes financially fragile. There's also a psychological reason behind this. People don't measure their financial health by long-term outcomes. They measure it by comparison. Am I doing as well as others? Can I afford what they can afford? Do I look financially stable? And in modern society, where spending is normalized, that standard keeps rising. So instead of asking, will this affect my future? The question becomes, can I afford this right now? And those are not the same. Because retirement isn't something that happens suddenly. It's something you either build quietly or ignore slowly. The real issue isn't just income, and it's not simply about how much you save. It's how most people are conditioned to think about money in the first place. Because from the very beginning, the system teaches a very specific pattern. Earn more, upgrade your life. Get a raise, move to a better place. Increase your income, improve your lifestyle. On the surface, this feels logical, even deserved. After all, if you're working harder and earning more, why shouldn't your life reflect that? But this is where a quiet shift happens. Your expenses don't just increase once, they adjust permanently. Let's go back to the same person. A few years pass. Their salary increases from $75,000 to $95,000. After taxes, maybe that's an extra $800 to $1,000 per month. Now, in theory, this is where financial progress should accelerate. But in reality, something else usually happens. They move to a slightly better apartment, upgrade their car, Start spending a bit more on convenience, nothing extreme, just small improvements that feel reasonable. And within a year, that extra income disappears. Not because they were careless, but because their lifestyle expanded to match it. This is what people often misunderstand. Financial pressure doesn't always come from low income. It comes from fixed commitments, the kind that repeat every single month without exception. Rent, car payments, insurance, subscriptions, debt repayments. These aren't flexible. They don't adjust when life becomes uncertain. They stay the same or increase. And over time, this creates a structure where your income is already pre-spent before you even receive it. Now here's the psychological layer. People don't experience lifestyle upgrades as risk. They experience them as progress. A better apartment feels like growth. A newer car feels like stability. Spending more feels like you've moved forward in life. But financially, something very different is happening. You're increasing the amount of money required just to maintain your current life. Not improve it, maintain it. And this becomes critical as retirement approaches, because retirement doesn't just remove your income, it exposes your cost of living completely. If your lifestyle requires $4,000 a month today, that number doesn't disappear when you stop working. If anything, it becomes more important, because now it has to be supported by savings, not salary. And this is where many people face a quiet realization. They didn't just build a life, they built a system that depends on continuous income. The difficult part is, none of this feels wrong in the moment. Every decision feels reasonable, every upgrade feels earned, every expense feels justified. But over 10, 20, 30 years, those decisions compound. Not just financially, but structurally. You don't notice it while you're earning, because the system works as long as money keeps coming in. But the closer you get to retirement, the more fragile that system becomes. In the next part, we'll look at what this means long-term, and how this pattern quietly determines whether retirement becomes freedom or a financial constraint most people never expected. If this pattern continues long enough, it leads to a very specific outcome. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually and predictably. Let's go back to the same person. They're now in their late 50s. They've worked for over 25 years. Their income is at its peak. On paper, this should be the most financially secure phase of their life. And in some ways, it is. They have a stable job, a home, a routine. But when you look deeper, the structure hasn't really changed. Their monthly pensies are still high, maybe even higher than before. Mortgage or rent is still there, or recently finished. Car payments may have been replaced with new ones. Healthcare costs are starting to increase, and lifestyle habits are fully built in. At this stage, reducing expenses isn't easy. Not because it's impossible, but because it feels like going backwards. After decades of progress, scaling down feels like failure. So instead, most people maintain their current lifestyle and rely on one assumption: I'll figure it out when I retire. But retirement doesn't create solutions, it reveals reality. Because the moment income stops, the entire system shifts. Every expense that once felt manageable now requires a different source: savings, investments, pensions. And this is where the pressure begins, not loudly, but quietly. Let's say their lifestyle requires $4,000 per month. That's $48,000 per year. Now multiply that by 20 years of retirement. That's nearly $1 million. And that's without accounting for inflation, or unexpected expenses, or healthcare. Now compare that to what many people actually have saved. $100,000, $200,000, maybe $300,000 if they'd been consistent. There's a gap, and it's not small. So what happens next? Most people adjust, but not in the way they expected. They delay retirement. work a few more years, then a few more, or they reduce their lifestyle, cut back on things they once considered normal, travel less, spend more cautiously, think more carefully about every decision, and in some cases, they become financially dependent on family, on government support, on systems they never expected to rely on. None of this happens because they failed. It happens because the structure they followed was never designed for long-term independence. It was designed for continuity, for earning, for spending, for maintaining a certain level of life as long as income exists. But retirement breaks that cycle completely. And this is the part most people don't prepare for, not financially, but mentally, because the real shift isn't just about money, it's about control. When you're earning, you have control. You can adjust, increase income, make changes, but in retirement, your flexibility is limited. Your income is fixed or reduced, and your margin for error becomes much smaller. So the question isn't just, how much have you saved? The real question is, have you built a life that can survive without your income? In the final part, we'll shift perspective, not toward extreme strategies, but toward how financially aware people think differently long before they reach this stage. At some point, the question changes. It's no longer about how much you earn, or even how much you save. It becomes about how you think, because financially aware people don't approach money the same way. Not necessarily more aggressively, not with extreme discipline, but with a different lens. They don't see income as something to expand their lifestyle. They see it as something to build distance from dependence. That doesn't mean they avoid spending or live in constant restriction, but they're aware of one thing most people overlook. Every financial decision has a long-term consequence, even if it feels small today. When their income increases, their first instinct isn't to upgrade everything around them. It's to protect the gap, the difference between what they earn and what they need, because that gap is what creates flexibility. And over time, flexibility becomes freedom. Instead of asking, "What can I afford right now?" they ask, "What does this commit me to long term?" A more expensive home isn't just a bigger space, it's a long-term obligation. A car upgrade isn't just comfort, it's a recurring cost that reduces future options. And when you start looking at money this way, something shifts. You stop optimizing for appearance and start optimizing for sustainability. This doesn't require perfection or extreme sacrifice. It requires awareness, because the goal isn't to avoid enjoying your life. It's to avoid building a life that only works when you're earning. And that's the difference. Financially aware people don't wait until their 50s or 60s to think about retirement. Not because they're obsessed with the future, but because they understand something simple. Time doesn't just pass. It compounds. Small decisions, repeated over years, create outcomes that feel much larger than the individual choices themselves. And the same is true in reverse. Small adjustments, slightly lower commitments, a bit more intentionality. Over time, those create space, options, and a quieter kind of security. Not the kind that looks impressive from the outside, but the kind that holds up when income is no longer there. Because in the end, retirement isn't a financial event, it's a structural one. It reveals whether your life was built on income or built to exist without it. And that realization doesn't need to create fear. It creates clarity, because the earlier you see it, the more time you have to adjust, calmly, rationally, without pressure, not to chase wealth, but to reduce dependence. And that might be the more realistic definition of financial freedom.